So I'm just gonna get right down to it. There is a topic that has been on my mind lately, and I felt it was the right time to make a video for it. So I think I've made it like all too clear, like way too obvious on this channel that I am a big fan of Scooby-Doo. But there is a question about it that's been on my mind lately, being the Halloween season and all, and that is Scooby-Doo horror? And the obvious answer to that is it depends on who you ask. For me personally, I would say absolutely. But you can't escape the fact that even if it has all of these horror elements, all of this horror imagery, it's not scary. I mean, it's a cartoon for little kids. But thinking about that question kind of led me to thinking about Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. We all know Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. Whenever people talk about what the best Scooby-Doo movie is, it's always Zombie Island. That's like everyone's go-to answer. And I think something I've noticed about that movie that no other Scooby-Doo movie tends to have is that it's probably the only one that is genuinely trying to be scary. And of course it was immediately followed up with Witch's Ghost, which I would say is also trying to be scary, but doesn't do it quite as well. But I think Zombie Island is really the ideal example of what Scooby-Doo can be. What that is a genuinely frightening movie for kids. It's got this really like beautiful, chilling autumn atmosphere. It feels very real-time in its approach to going from dusk till dawn, and it's just something in horror movies that I've noticed I tend to love, when you have something that feels like it's happening in the moment. And of course, despite this being so talked about, so beloved, there has never been a Scooby-Doo movie that has come close to Zombie Island. And that led me to thinking about the current state of it, where it's at today. Now, nowadays there is a lot of Scooby-Doo media. It used to be you'd get like one animated movie a year. Now it's like you get 3 animated movies a year, and they all kind of feel, well, not kinda, they do feel very rushed out. Like not a lot of thought was put into them, and you can tell that the animation really suffers from just how rushed out they are. I've kind of noticed that over the years there's been a gradual decline in quality. Like the first 4 movies they did, which was a different studio, but those looked beautiful, and then we got some other movies that followed it up that also looked pretty nice, and then over time, as they made more of them, it just started to look worse and worse. But I think it is safe to say that with the recent writer's strike and with the current state of Warner Brothers, which is a huge dumpster fire right now, I think it's safe to say that things have kind of slowed down. And I don't know if it's because they're rethinking their approach, or if they're gonna go right back to doing what they were doing before as soon as they've got everything sort of figured out. But I do think that now would be the perfect opportunity to reevaluate their approach. It's about time that Warner Brothers Animation Company decided to focus less on quantity and more on quality. Now, I do think that Scooby-Doo is a franchise with a lot of missed opportunities, and a lot of that is really because it's, in a way, held back by being something made for kids. It's a franchise that is very much focused on being kid-friendly, which I get. It's Scooby-Doo, that's really what it's supposed to be. But you have some recent examples I can think of, like Scoob is a good example, where it's Scooby-Doo and it kind of drops everything that's interesting about it, and instead it goes an entirely different route that they think will appeal more towards kids, but it's just not doing it. We've got some other examples like Velma on HBO Max, which was geared towards adults and very much could have gone the horror route. There actually is a bit of horror elements in it, but it's far too focused on the comedy for anything in it to actually be considered scary, and not very good comedy at that. I think I talked about this in my video on Velma, but I recall reading an article about an executive that told them they weren't allowed to use Scooby. And I think it's because people must just associate a talking dog with kids' cartoons. But honestly, I think that's just total BS. I don't even know how true it is, but it just sounds like one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But I've noticed that like DC has no problem doing both. You can have a show like Harley Quinn that exists, and then you have Bat Wheels, which is made for like preschoolers. So I was really thinking about that, how Scooby-Doo hasn't really taken advantage of its horror elements since Zombie Island. Scooby-Doo also tends to have this formula that really lends itself perfectly to horror. Like, it's laid out for it. I think Zombie Island is proof of that. If Warner Brothers had been willing to do more movies like Zombie Island, we could have some really good horror movies for kids. And I think if you wanted to take Scooby-Doo a more horror route, it would work. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. Whether you take the slasher approach where it's a killer wearing a mask, or you just do Zombie Island again and have real monsters show up. It's funny because you see these like actual real horror movies that took clear inspiration from Scooby-Doo. Like every time I watch a Scream movie, I just think, this is just Scooby-Doo, but as a slasher film. And I think it's funny that Scooby-Doo is just so afraid to kind of delve into horror again, since there's clear examples of why it could work so well. There are some rare exceptions when it does tend to go more horror route, or at least takes itself more seriously. One example is the Supernatural crossover from a few years back, which honestly, one of my favorite things to come out of the franchise from the past few years, and I don't even watch Supernatural. And then there's like Scooby Apocalypse, which is a comic series. I have tried to read it multiple times and I can never get into it. It's a more violent, darker take on Scooby-Doo, but it doesn't really use the formula in any way. It just takes those characters and sets them in the apocalypse. It's completely doing its own thing. But I feel like by doing that, you're kind of missing the point, because like I keep saying, the formula is there. It lends itself perfectly to horror, and for some reason, Warner Brothers just doesn't want to do anything with that. So here are my ideas. This right here, this is why I made the video. Really all I'm trying to say is I would like to see more Scooby-Doo media, whether it's theatrical, whether it's straight to DVD, whether it's a comic book series, I don't care. I would just like to see more Scooby-Doo media that is true to the spirit of it, while taking the horror a tad more seriously. And I think it can work as something for kids or for adults. You could take a darker approach to the series, I'd be cool with that. But if you want to do more kid stuff like you did with, like I keep saying, Zombie Island, then yeah, I would love that too. Honestly, I think the best approach is when you can combine horror and comedy successfully. There are some spooky horror comedy movies that tend to do well with kids, whether it be Coraline or Paranorman. And I'm not saying that Laika should animate a Scooby-Doo movie, but I'd be down for that. But I would like to see something like that. Like, if you're gonna do a theatrical film for this franchise, then yeah, play up the horror, do something with it. Horror does not mean for adults. There are many horror movies for kids, and I would like to see more of that. And as I mentioned, you could do a comic book series. I know Afterlife with Archie and the Sabrina comics were popular, and you definitely don't need to drop Scooby or his ability to talk. Even if you're doing like a more serious or darker adaptation, just come up with some nonsense. That's what Mystery Incorporated did. But I really think the talking dog is half the fun, so if you're dropping that, it's another example of missing the point. Anyway, that is a wrap. That is just some rambling I wanted to have about something that's been on my mind for a while. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and you all have a happy Halloween. Goodbye.